Good evening and welcome. I'm Nora Kane. I'm the director of the Stanford Health Library, and you've tuned in this evening to a wonderful talk that I'm sure everyone will enjoy by the author of his most recent book, The Genome Odyssey, Dr. Euan Ashley. Um, and I'm going to do an introduction. I'd love to tell you that it was short, but because he's so accomplished, it's really hard to keep it short. Born in Scotland, Dr. Ashley graduated with first-class honors in physiology and medicine from the University of Glasgow. He completed medical residency and a PhD at the University of Oxford before moving to Stanford University, where he trained in cardiology and advanced heart failure, joining the faculty in 2006. His group is focused on the science of precision medicine. In 2010, he led the team that carried out the first clinical interpretation of a human genome. The article became one of the most cited in clinical medicine that year and was later featured in the Genome exhibition at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Over the following 3 years, the team extended the approach to the first whole genome molecular autopsy to a family of 4 and to a case series of patients in primary care. They now routinely apply genome sequencing to the diagnosis of patients at Stanford Hospital, where Dr. Ashley directs the clinical genome program and the Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease. Dr. Ashley has a passion for rare genetic disease and was the first co-chair of the steering committee of the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. He was a recipient of the National Innovation Award from the American Heart Association and the NIH Director's New Innovator Award. He is part of the winning team of the 75 million One Brave Idea competition and co-founder of 3 companies, Personalis Incorporated, Deep Cell Inc., and Spexa Inc. He was recognized by the Obama White House for his contributions to personalized medicine, and in 2018 was awarded the American Heart Association Medal of Honor for genomic and precision medicine. He was appointed Stanford Associate Dean in 2019. In 2021, his first book, The Genome Odyssey, Medical Mysteries and the Incredible Quest to Solve Them, was released. Father to 3 young Americans, in his spare time, he tries to understand American football, plays jazz saxophone, and conducts research on the health benefits of single malt whiskey. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ashley here tonight, and he will be in conversation with one of his patients, with whom he will introduce in a moment. At this point, I'm going to turn it over, but one more note. In the audience, if you have questions, at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A bar where you can enter your questions, and Dr. Ashley will be able to see them and will address them as he goes through or at the end. Thanks so much. Enjoy this evening.
Well, Nora, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for everything that you've done for the Stanford Health Library over so many years. It's been my privilege to be part of several events over the years. You've been nice enough to ask me back, and I've always enjoyed interacting with the members of our community at these events and talking about sometimes complicated science and complicated medicine with the people who pay for it, first of all, the taxpayers who pay for it, but for those with whom it really matters. But I haven't in any of those events done what we're about to do this evening, and I'm so thrilled that we'll have an opportunity for you to see in the audience really a glimpse of what we do, which is interact, talk with patients. And I think you're going to be just amazed by the stories that you'll hear from our guest speaker this evening. Before we get to that, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the book that is just over one of my shoulders here. And how it came to be, and I'll tell you just a little bit about myself first and how I came to write that. I'm, as you can probably tell, those of you who may have heard me talk before, if you haven't, you can probably detect a slight Scottish accent. I came from Scotland. I was born and brought up there. I was born into a medical family. My dad was and is a GP, retired now. My mom, a midwife. So I was surrounded by medicine from a young age, and from as long as I can remember, 5 years old, I wanted to be a doctor. My dad and my mom would both take me on house calls back in the day, and GPs would go to your house. My mom, as a midwife, would go to patients' houses, and we lived in a very interesting part of Glasgow in the west of Scotland, where we had a fairly affluent area on one side and a relatively poorer area on the other. And my parents practiced in both, and so I got to see all the social determinants of healthcare play out in that setting. And that was a huge inspiration for me and remains to this day a big inspiration. But around maybe 12 years old, I realized something else, that not only did I want to be a doctor, but that I was an enormous geek. My dad bought this little home computer with rubber keys to play with at home. And I, as well as wasting many hours playing games, as most young kids do, I also learned how to program those computers and was just amazed at the things I could make this little machine do. And so I started with a little horse racing game where you made your fingers go really fast to make your horse go faster. That didn't make me a millionaire, but my friends enjoyed it. I also built a tax program for my dad's practice to try and help him. I noticed there was essentially a pattern with the tax code that was pretty easily computable, and so I built a program to save him money. Since then, I continued to be a geek and really was drawn to Silicon Valley from really the time of my earliest time at college. Was lucky enough to come here during the summer of the Netscape IPO and really get some of the Silicon Valley bug and really have a sense of what technology could bring to the world. But in actually coming and moving here in 2002 after a PhD at Oxford, I really realized what technology could bring to healthcare. And over the last 10 or 15 years, I've really been privileged to be here at Stanford as part of the faculty, building a team that is focused on the human genome and what our technology, the technology that allows us to read the 6 billion base pairs of your genome, can bring to individuals, and individuals like our guest this evening who are affected by genetic diseases. But the speed at which that technology has moved has just been jaw-dropping, honestly. We often compare things in Silicon Valley to Moore's law, this idea that every 18 months the number of transistors on an integrated circuit would double, kind of emblematic of just how fast computer power moves on. But the cost, or the reduction in cost, of sequencing the human genome dropped at a much faster rate than Moore's law, to the point that now, having spent $3 billion on sequencing the first genome, the Human Genome Project, you can now sequence a human genome for $500. And that massive $1 million drop in cost, the equivalent of buying a Ferrari for 1 cent, is what has driven so much of our interest in this area. But where it really comes to reality is at the real human level, because that technology applied can make differences to people's lives. And this is what drove me in the end to write the book, inspired by patients such as Leilani, who you'll meet in a moment, and just the incredible life that they live and the journey that they lead. I really hope to share that with more people and to really spread the word and spread word, I think, of hope. I hoped overall to more patients. But also I've been privileged to be part of these scientific teams who are able to put together the tools that allow us to understand the human genome and apply it to medicine. And what started with maybe the first interpretation of a human genome here at Stanford about 10 years ago, that of my colleague Steve Quake, has now expanded out as many teams around the world have built similar tools and started to really apply the genome to the point where it's almost at the point where it's routine to be able to sequence a genome and apply that knowledge to both diagnostic care, understanding diseases, and in the future, starting, well, maybe we'll get to this in the discussion, starting this year at Stanford, preventive care, really thinking about what might be in your future and getting ahead of it. So that's some of the excitement that led me to write the book, to tell some of these stories. And it couldn't have been done both without the amazing environment here around Stanford and the ability to be part of these scientific teams. But much more importantly, and the focus for tonight, the really generosity of my patients in sharing their stories. And not everybody knows this, but the first story that I wrote for the book is the one that you're going to get a live version of tonight. And so it's told across a couple of different chapters in the book, but way better than reading my words in the book is actually hearing from the patient herself. And so it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce you to somebody who I've known now for many years, I guess more than 10. We'll get into that in a few moments. We first met when she was, I think, either around 16 or 17 years old. And we were struck at the time, my medical team, by just how poised this young woman was at that time and the level of questions that she was asking us. And it was clear that this was a very special person. And that was before she went through many of the things that you're going to hear about that relate to her medical journey over the next few years. So let me officially introduce you now to the, I must say, award-winning writer, because she recently won an award for her writing. And if you get a chance to check out her writing, please do that. You can read my book later, read her writing first. But award-winning writer, speaker, patient advocate, and just really inspirational figure, someone I'm really privileged to know, Leilani Graham. Welcome.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. And they should definitely read your book first.
Yeah, well, we'll agree that they should read both. So that's great. And if people have showed up tonight, that's a good start. Thank you all for joining us. Well, so Leilani, why don't we go back to the first time we met? I mean, I certainly talk about in the story our impression of the first time we met. But first of all, you had a life before we met that was kind of eventful. So maybe why don't you start there and then take us up to the moment when we did actually meet? But
Sure.
Well, tell us about those memories.
So I was, well, it's so funny we're talking about this now because I've been going through some old paperwork, and I found a journal that I had written right before my first introduction to heart disease and heart failure. And it had this incredible schedule that I never kept to, but every day was, work out, do homework, go to soccer, all this stuff. And it is emblematic of what I was doing back then. It just wasn't to the minute. But I was, born and raised Silicon Valley kid, so completely overscheduled, but really enjoyed doing team sports and everything from soccer to theater. It was kind of try everything, and at that point, I had just sort of realized that I wasn't going to be the best athlete necessarily, but I enjoyed doing it. But there was, in hindsight, of course, there was a little bit of maybe I'm just never going to get better at this. But we really had no idea until I was running on a treadmill in my parents' garage. And just lost consciousness. I don't remember any of this, but according to my mother, I was seizing on the floor, not responsive, but still conscious. They called 911 and their first thought was, did she take something? Which was not typical of me at the time, but for a 13-year-old girl is definitely a concern. And long story short, at the hospital, I was diagnosed very evidently with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And I think I got an ICD the next day. And the first thing I remember is waking up and asking my dad. And you get that feeling like, oh, I've asked him already what was going on. And that completely changed everything from that moment on.
Well, and your mom and dad were kind enough, as you know well, also to sit down with me. And I was familiar with your story, of course, from before. You were kind enough to formally sit for an interview for the book, so we could dig into a few more details that we wouldn't necessarily remember without that. But I was so struck with your mom's description of that first moment, really, when life changed completely for them and for you, when she was at home and you were running on the treadmill behind the wall next door, and she just heard this sound that was, I think she said almost animal-like, just something that didn't sound entirely human. And so I started off, as you know, the chapter with that, because it was just such a gripping moment. I can't imagine just such a pivotal moment to go from everything's completely normal, you're athletic, you're enjoying life as far as they're concerned, just regular things are happening in the family, and suddenly that reality is shocked with this change. And then I do remember as well your dad mentioning, it's great to hear from you that you remember the loss of short-term memory, but he was describing the same thing, that you would wake up and ask some questions about where am I, what happened, and then you'd kind of go off to sleep and you'd wake up again and say where am I, what happened, and that would happen multiple times. But that's something that is clearly, those immediately after the first part, maybe you remember less about that first part, but it's obviously very crystal clear from then on.
Yeah, and now having not to jump ahead, but having had many experiences with Versed now in a medical setting, I understand why I kept asking what was happening.
Yeah, well, some of that would be, so Versed is this midazolam, this sedative agent that also hits your short-term memory, but some of it would likely have been that original event, which was a cardiac arrest. Your heart went from essentially pumping normally with 2 heart sounds, ba-dum, 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 like a normal heart, to basically just wobbling, where there's no blood coming out. And when there's no blood coming out, your brain shuts down and you collapse unconscious. And so that also hits the short-term memory cells in your brain first before it hits the others. And unfortunately, they come back. But it is very disorientating at the beginning. And you mentioned an ICD, just for our audience here, that's an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. As the cardiologist, I'm obliged to explain that to everyone. But one of the things that was fun in the book, actually, and I deliberately intertwined this with your story as we talk about the history of the use of electricity to start and stop the heart. And some of the most kind of jaw-dropping observations from history in that story, I came up as part of that research. I mean, some of the early work with Leiden jars from the Dutch city of Leiden, where they first were able to put a battery together. Even Benjamin Franklin got interested in these batteries. But there's one guy, avant-garde, he has this idea he was going to make a name for himself by shocking a horse, first of all. So he would line up these Leiden jars and try to kind of kill the horse. I mean, it's not very, no animal committee is going to approve of that these days. But then he was not successful. And so then he thought, well, I need a smaller animal. And there was a chicken or a hen running around. So he like wrestled it to the ground and like shocked it across its head, and it fell over, dead. And then he was like, well, now I'm going to bring it back to life. And he started shocking it again. And he tried the head multiple times, and this bird just would not come back to life. And so finally he was about to give up, and he just decided to shock across the chest. And he gave this electric shock across the chest of this hen, and it woke up and basically started walking around. And a few days later, after wobbling for a bit, it started laying eggs again and was completely fine after that. Just like a mind-blowing story of like, obviously from years ago. And there's a whole story that we will not go into of a long series of narratives that lead up through the ages. That was 300 or 400 years ago, that lead to the point now where there's a small device that can be implanted under the skin that can monitor every beat of the heart and potentially deliver a shock, a life-saving shock, in the event that happens. So yeah, so delivering a life-saving shock. So tell us about that. That's something that you know quite a lot about.
I do, but I'm fortunate to have never felt it. When I was listening to your audiobook and hearing that story about the chicken, I just kind of had this visceral reaction of, just in clinic, we talk about it's a shock or a kick, but there isn't necessarily that, putting two and two together of, oh, it's actually electricity. And it's, that kind of shock, because you see it on TV and it's more like the patient convulses. It just doesn't necessarily come together. So that part of your book was fascinating to me. But yes, I ended up having 3 more shocks, all appropriate. But my second was pretty soon after the first, when we didn't really know the limitations at that point. I'd been running in a rural place in Mexico the week before my first shock, so there wasn't necessarily a baseline for what I should be doing at that point. And you tell the story quite well in your book, but that I had been sitting out of PE for a while, just as part of recovery. And one particular day, there was a substitute PE teacher who kind of cajoled me into participating in the relay. And I got, 3/4 of the way around the track and felt like my legs were lead and I couldn't breathe. And I woke up with, a face full of dirt. So fortunately, it didn't land on the asphalt. I think there's been a lot of lucky moments in my cardiac arrests, multiple, but that was the second.
And for our audience, you'll have noticed that Leilani is finding lucky moments in her cardiac arrest. That phrase, just one of the most remarkable aspects of your whole story is your ability to maintain your humor, frankly, through these unbelievable life events. And so yeah, and I think a bad day for that particular substitute teacher.
Yeah, pretty bad day.
Yeah. And so since we're counting them down, that certainly wasn't the last time you felt a shock. What about?
No, it wasn't. The next one, I was, I think, 16 or 17. This was, I think, very shortly before I met you guys. I was in Los Altos Hills for a friend's birthday, and fun thing to do in Los Altos Hills at the time when it was being developed was to go visit some construction sites at night and try to see the stars.
Yeah, as you do.
So trespassing, I ended up getting to the top of the hill and completely passing out, and that was shock number 3. And that one was pretty clear that it was coming in retrospect. I got halfway up and thought, okay, either I fall all the way down or I get to the top and then pass out.
Well, and when you were retelling us that story, what struck me so much, and I pulled it out in the narrative in the book, was, I think you were giving your friends instructions as you felt this was coming on. You're like, in a moment, I'm going to collapse. You're going to need to call 911. This is what's going to happen, and then you're gone. I mean, it's just like what did your friends think of that?
Well, it's interesting, and to your point earlier about making humor out of it, certainly in that age, it was sort of like Leilani's kind of funky quirk. It wasn't so much of a, life-threatening condition.
Yeah.
And so I turned to that friend and said, you need to call 911. And the poor guy, he yells out to everybody in front of us, and they're like, yeah, whatever. Because there was kind of a running joke in our group of, don't pop out of somewhere or Leilani's going to have a heart attack.
Right.
Which, was funny at the time. And
teenage humor.
Teenage humor, exactly. Teenage humor. And so it took them a second to come back and realize how serious it was, but he wasn't believed initially.
Yeah, no, that I think those would be a long few minutes while they were waiting for you to come back around. Again, kind of incredible. And then I think between then and this is not the last shot we'll talk about, but that was when you met us, I think, wasn't it? Is that the first time?
I think so. I think it was just right after. Mm-hmm.
And it might be good to chat then, since the book's about the genome. That's when you met us for the first time, we were talking quite a lot about genetics. That was one of the things. Obviously, you were getting ready to come over to the adult side of the hospital. But also one of the things that we had started doing in the clinic at that point was offering genetic testing. And as you mentioned, this disease, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we've known about it for 350 years. But the genetic basis of it has only really been known for about 20 years. And understanding the underlying genetic basis of the disease allows significant power in the form of help with the family and understanding who's at risk and who's not. And so that was the case in your family as well. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it was interesting because in retrospect, I can't remember if my parents were screened before meeting you guys, not genetically, but even with echoes.
Yeah, I don't remember either.
You don't recall, but yeah, I mean, that was, for us, it was kind of a no-brainer when you asked us, is that something that you're comfortable with? Interestingly, I also come from a medical family, except for my father, who, all of his grandfathers were doctors, but he can't stand blood, so he was a lawyer. But we understand.
I thought you were going to say he can't stand doctors, so he's a lawyer. That was enough.
No, just kidding. He did practice in medicine, but yeah, I think for us it was very clear. I mean, we come from a very scientific, positive area, that it was the right thing to do genetic testing, and in part because my younger sister was about to reach the age I was when I'd had my first cardiac arrest, and so our concern was largely for her if she was also at risk.
Yeah, and well, I guess we are going to give much of this away, but we're normally looking for one change, like one letter change in 6 billion letters of your genome. You get 2 copies of each gene, one from your mom, one from your dad. And for this condition, we're used to looking for and often finding one variant, so simply one letter change in one gene. And so often then we're looking for one of the parents to have passed it on. But that wasn't exactly what happened in your case.
No, and there was actually one from each parent, both on, I think it was MYC BP3. Am I saying that right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Right. Possible tattoo one day, we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was one different variant, but on the same gene. And that was quite surprising. It made me think back to how they'd met, and both from Palo Alto and not, related, should make that clear. But anyway, it was fascinating, the fact that that had coincided to give me both variants.
Yeah, so we're not only talking about one, you get one from one of your parents, but in your case, you got one from each, and that also explained to an extent why neither of them had been showing signs of this condition. You basically had these 2 variants come together in both your copies of this one really critical gene. The protein for this gene is part of the molecular motor for the heart, so it's a really important part of how your heart literally contracts. And often if you lose one copy through a genetic variation, the other one can sort of fill in a little bit, and depends exactly on the kind of variant you have. But if you have both copies hit, well, now you're in in a slightly more difficult situation, and that I think explained why at such a young age you had such a severe version of the disease. Now, of course, it's possible probability-wise to get 2 or 1 or 0, and so I know that your sister was kind enough to allow us to share her part of the story here as well, and she was tested.
Yeah, she was tested and she was negative, which was quite a relief to my parents and myself. She also got the gene that allows you to tan. She was much more athletic. So there are some things that weren't there, but no, she's done really well. Been a huge supporter of all of us. I mean, as my dad has, maybe this is jumping the shark a little bit, but has gone on to develop some, phenotypic signs of HCM as well.
Yeah, and that's certainly obviously what part of knowing the genetic basis of the disease is knowing then where to shine the spotlight for an individual family, like who we need to watch really carefully and who is kind of off the hook, and that allows us to direct the spotlight in the right way. So obviously part of that spotlight then went on your parents, knowing each one of them had a variant that could contribute to the disease. And yeah, as you say, we'll maybe come to that as we go. So that was our first meeting, and as I mentioned in the introduction, I was just blown away with the level of questions that you were asking at the time. I think you'd spent a bit of time and read up on it, and so this was the early days of genetic testing for this condition and for cardiovascular conditions generally. And so we were not used to having patients who already kind of knew the textbook before we met them.
Well, I happened to be in AP Bio at the time, so I literally knew the textbooks.
So that was our first meeting. So yeah, and then I think that we jump a little bit forward, and you were, as I think is obvious to everyone, but from your bio there as well, very interested in and very talented in the performing arts. So tell us about that and how that took you to the other side of the country.
Yeah, so once I stopped playing sports and doing less physical activities, theater had always been in my background. I'd been doing plays and musicals since I was 5. And I started to recognize in high school, maybe that's my card to get into college and something I could pursue beyond, and ended up getting into NYU, and that was the dream school for me at the time. And flew across the country, much to the chagrin of my parents, but was in the middle of New York City then as an 18-year-old from a bubble town, and now having to speed walk to class. It was I remember being in constant conversation with you and with Heidi Salisbury of how do we tell my teachers that this is not physically possible, because it's so rare, I think, especially then for administrators to have any experience with people with invisible disabilities. So that was quite an issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you made in the book, that it can be very difficult if there isn't an obvious external kind of flag of a disability. Like how do you deal with that and cope with that? And we reflected at that time, we take our patients, put them on a treadmill and sort of torture them a little bit to try and work out how their heart is working. What we don't do is force them to do that outside in cold weather with snow around them, and so it's quite a stress test moving to New York for school. And I think, there was another event there after one of your singing lessons. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was leaving a voice lesson. Interestingly, I was already sort of on the path to thinking I would transfer. But that was really hit the nail on the head, was when I came out of the voice lesson. It was in the basement, only went up maybe 2 flights of stairs. And, I can see my voice teacher walking ahead of me to leave. He's maybe 40 paces ahead of me. And I'm starting to black out and I can't even call out to him. It was so fast that it happened. And all of a sudden I wake up and I'm on the sidewalk and, just almost in a cinematic way, all my binders are spread out and I'm looking up at the sky going, I don't remember lying down. So that was number 4. And that was enough to make me move back to the West Coast.
Yeah, number 4, the 4th cardiac arrest that you've suffered, just to underline this for everyone in the audience, that is not common. And that situation where the device brought you back again, a testament to all those hundreds of years of sort of a development in order to put that technology inside, but also a huge testament to your resilience in the face of this condition. You're just getting on with life, and it rears its ugly head and quite literally knocks you on the streets of New York City. and you just get back up again. You're describing your conversation with the EMT folks who came, and how you're like, maybe I'm not going to call my parents, or I'll just tell them later, and maybe okay, I need to go to the hospital, but I don't really need the ambulance. Maybe I'll just take the bus. Or,
Exactly.
and this guy's like, nah, that's
overnight. It felt more like an inconvenience at the time.
right.
There's still a running joke in my family about, you have to call us first. Don't text, hey, mom, I'm in the ambulance. So communication style.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. So anyway, so that was part of the final nail in the coffin for New York as a school. You came back to LA, or to Southern California, and the weather was better there, I hear.
Much better. Much better. And driving in LA is quite a thing, so that worked well for me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I remember we did a few, these days with the pandemic, and not least this event tonight, we've been doing a lot of virtual visits, but I think you may have been the first patient we ever did a virtual visit with, actually, because it was a bit clunky, not quite the smooth Zoom that we have now, but you were in your dorm down there, and we were talking through a few different things. Just tell us a little bit more about that part of life and how things were going.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that, because when the telemedicine started in the pandemic and all the news outlets are saying, can this work? Is this a thing? In my head, I was going, well, we've been doing this for 10 years. I don't understand what the problem is.
What's so hard?
Yeah, it's so obvious. I think at the time, going into my junior and senior year, I had definitely noticed a decline in my ability to go upstairs, to walk quickly to class. I was sleeping until 11 every day. I never, ever had an 8 a.m. class. And I kind of attributed it to my just sort of general demeanor. I'm a sleepy person. I just sort of like hanging out, but it became clear through stress tests that I was doing, or CPXs at the time, every 6 months, that I think things were declining at that point. And that was one of the first things we talked about. Yeah.
And I think that from our perspective as doctors to patients who we know, not every disease necessarily progresses, but when the diseases present at a young age, as they had with yours, and are associated with multiple cardiac arrests, I think it's pretty clear that at some point it's likely the heart will begin to fail, and we'll have to have that difficult conversation about a heart transplant. And obviously that moment came. We were sort of circling around it for a while, and then there's a moment where we had to have that conversation. But what was going through your head around that kind of time?
Well, again, I remember feeling rather inconvenienced because I had just started at Google, and I was very excited to kind of crush it there, which it sounds very startup-y. But it definitely changed the trajectory of life as a whole. I mean, I started thinking, maybe my dreams of going back to LA are not feasible. I had been talking with your team for a long time about the possibility of having children. Honestly, those were things in my mind I was thinking about more than, oh, I'm dying. It was just, oh, now I can't do these things I wanted to do. And so that's age, that's, the way I grew up and the way that my disease was treated as I grew up, but it was quite a shock.
Yeah. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how to bring this up and how to, talk to our patients about it. And I think many cases it's a stop-start process. We bring it up a little bit, and then we sort of back off a bit, and we sort of judge the reception, and then we maybe bring it up again a little bit. And in the end, among those of us who do this kind of work with patients who eventually need transplants, we say that quite often the patient in the end tells us that wasn't quite exactly the case with you, but for many of the patients, eventually they go, look, you've been talking about this and I've been pushing you away, but I can't live like this any longer, and I need, it's time. And I think many of our patients who've been through transplant, that would resonate with them as an experience. I think you were, with your youthful vigor, were maybe a little bit more pushed back a little bit more than most. Yeah.
Well, it never felt so acute. It was always just, well, life's been this way and it's a little harder, but I don't have to walk to campus anymore. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily that internalization yet of this needs to happen.
And diseases, I think, creep up on you when you've lived with them your whole life. You know, it's a slow change that just you get used to and you adjust for, and you don't quite realize the extent to which you have adjusted for it. And that's your reality. And there's an extent to which somebody suggesting there's a different reality, even if at some level that would hopefully be a better reality, that is a big step to take. Just never mind the bridge you have to cross to get to it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. What about that bridge then? I mean, I can't quite imagine, you know, you get the call. Tell us about that.
Well, I, always have to include the anecdote that I was exactly 3.5 hours away, and the max I was allowed to be was 4 hours. And, it was interesting. I think I'd been pushed up on the list like 2 weeks beforehand. I had stopped working. And even then I, was up at only 3,000 foot altitude, but going up one flight of stairs, it was like, I'm upstairs for the day, we're not going back and forth. Right. And so, I mean, getting the call was very surreal. I have many friends who are transplant patients who have been overjoyed, or who were scared, or who were in the hospital and were like, thank God I'm going to be saved. For me, it felt like an alternate reality. And I think that's probably true of my parents as well. And even my friends, who were like, well, we'll see you tomorrow, right? It's like, I think I have to be here for a while. Even telling some of my friends I was getting a transplant, more than once I heard, so is it the whole heart, or is it like half of it?
Right.
So, it was difficult for, even my age group to portend. So,
yeah. Well, and for everyone who's listening, it is most of the heart, almost the entire heart. There's a little bit of the back wall and some of the blood vessels to which the new heart is attached. And many of those fundamental experiments that were done initially to develop heart transplantation were actually done at Stanford. And so there's been a long history of heart transplantation here. And so, but yeah, there's every single heart transplant is its own adventure for everyone. I mean, the amount of coordination that needs to happen to bring those teams together, it's not quite like you see it on TV, but there are elements of that kind of coordinated dance when a donor is available, and then a match is made, and then a team flies out to get the organ and then flies it back. I'm always amazed that they bring the organ back in what looks like a sandwich box. I mean, it really is a sandwich box, just with a sticker on it that says, organ for transplant. There's also like a form that you fill in online on a website where you're listing someone for transplant, and it says organ, and then you click the organ or organs that you want for the patient. It just seems so far away from what a heart transplant really is. Clicking heart, kidney, just amazing compared to that lived experience. So, well, we talk about how it went very smoothly. The heart came back in the plane, and Phil Orr, your surgeon, sewed it in, and you came back. And in fact, I remember seeing you quite soon after. You were awake and the breathing tube was out, and I do remember thinking I hadn't seen anyone look quite that good after a heart transplant, maybe ever before. And that was a great moment, but it didn't actually last very long, that moment, did it?
Yeah, not so much. Yeah, it was interesting because there's a little period of time where I do remember feeling somewhat unchanged from going in at like more awake, but a lot of transplant patients describe having a very, very weakened heart and then feeling a stronger heart, whereas with HCM I always felt it was too strong.
Right.
And so I didn't have that same realization, but obviously when and this better than me, frankly, even reading the book, I was learning things I was like, oh, I didn't realize so-and-so was there, or that was the transgression of things. But essentially it was primary graft failure at the time.
Yeah, basically, and yeah, what happened was that this new heart, this brand new heart that had been put into you after all this time living with this old one and these multiple cardiac arrests and the whole lead up to that and everything, and having spent most of that first day looking amazing, thinking you were going to be flying out of the hospital a few days later, your heart started to stop, and basically there was a long pause where it just didn't beat. And so obviously there was a crash, and everybody ran to the bedside and were like, what's going on? And the breathing tube was put back in, and we were looking at the heart, and there were like surgeons and doctors and me, and there were like just a whole range of people like, what was happening? And then we were staring at the monitor. I remember it really well. And we're like, what this? It didn't fit any of the patterns, because there have been times, and we've learned over the years about times that organs can fail, but there were no signs of this. And this brand new heart that looked pristine, just it wasn't beating. And then it came back, and then it looked normal, and then it stopped again. And at that point, we were just not taking any chances, and we just wheeled you straight to the operating room and put you on a heart-lung bypass machine so that we would save your life, protect you until we worked out what was going on with your heart. And I imagine things were pretty fuzzy over the course of the next week or so, because you were on a lot of that drip, that sedative drip,
Yeah.
and on the heart-lung machine. But you were safe, so we breathed a sigh of relief. But as I mentioned in the book, I remember that night your mom and dad had been there, and I think they'd gone for coffee, and then this happened, and suddenly they came back, and there were just monitors blaring, and there were suddenly 35 people around your bed, and that I just can't understand. I can't really begin to think about what that was like for them to.
That was interesting. The way you put it in the book, it made me think again, that was sort of, if you will, a lucky event, because yes, it was very traumatizing for them to come back, and my dad instantly knew it was me. They weren't at the bedside. They were not seeing their daughter dying. So I'm quite grateful for that. But
yeah, your perspective on this is just stunning as always. But yeah, so I remember looking out over the campus in the darkness of that night, talking about this, and it just there's no easy way to have that conversation, and I do my best to comfort them. But there was an uncertain few days. But the good news was that over time the heart seemed to stabilize, and we didn't see any more of those pauses, and so over time we were able to take the heart-lung machine off. Incredible thing was the stress of that moment was what essentially brought out your dad's diagnosis for the first time. And you were lying here in the hospital, and we knew he had the gene. We'd been watching him closely for a few years. But the moment when I think actually we'd had a monitor on him, because he quietly told us he was having these palpitations. We hadn't said anything to you. We were not, but we got the result back as you were lying in bed, sort of slowly recovering off this machine, and realized that he was now suffering from these funny rhythms of his heart, the bad rhythms. And because we knew what happened to you, and he would have the same gene as you, he was going to need a defibrillator too. I mean, it was amazing, the resilience you had. And he was very matter of fact, after what he'd lived through, he was like, oh, sure, of course.
Yeah, there's no question.
He's like, yeah, okay, got it. And we were like, but this is crazy. And he's like, no, I'm concerned about her. And so that's where his focus was at the time.
I was quite proud of him for that, because he's not one to volunteer information to a doctor if he doesn't have to.
Right.
So I've tried to remind him of that over the years. Do you remember when you talked about it and something was there to help you?
Spoken like a true daughter. So well, and then and I'll say we have another little portion of this story that takes us into the genome territory that I want to talk to you about here, but also just to take a moment to say to everyone who's listening, we do have the question and answer it's a little section. If you click on it, please feel free to type any questions you have. In just a few minutes I will look at those and try to answer a few questions. So feel free to add in there or upvote any questions you see that you would like to have answered. So then what about the mystery, if you like? Your story is remarkable in so many ways, but we actually knew what your diagnosis was quite early. That wasn't a mystery. And then we got the genetic diagnosis, and that wasn't so much of a mystery. But the mystery with your case came with this new heart. You've been transplanted a heart that in every way that we could determine at the time looked pristine, and yet it had stopped and then started again and stopped and started again. And then eventually you did have the pacemaker put back in, which can't have been fun. And sorry that was the case, but tell us about that.
Yeah, I think you'd alluded to this in the book, that I'd kind of had that sense for a while that something was wrong. And I do remember asking you actually at one point on ECMO in the ICU, the options I knew at the time: are we going to relist? Are we putting in a pacemaker? Are we, can't get the old one back? And that was, sort of kind of had stayed with me over time as there were more and more complications. And particularly after finding out that the heart had complete heart block and needed a pacemaker. You know, having had such a clear genetic diagnosis before, I was adamant that we should test for it, to the point where I was maybe a little premature and asked for an additional biopsy sample during a routine procedure that got thawed and was thrown out. But fortunately, the team came together and
I mean, true to form, this is something that certainly had occurred to us, and we were still at the point of saying, well, how would we do that? And is it really, what are the chances? And, you know, what are we going to find? And we were still humming and hawing, honestly. We hadn't decided one way or the other. And meanwhile, I think you were there saying, no, we've got to do this. We have to do this. It's like, here's why. And it was compelling, and that's why we did it. So now, just for everyone, again, just to step back. So now you have a heart that used to belong to someone else inside you, your own genome. So your blood and your lungs and your kidney and your brain, that's all your genome. But this new heart that you have inside you, that's someone else's genome. So you now are somebody with two genomes. And so when we think about the fact that we have to somehow do a genome sequencing study on your heart, we need a piece of your heart. There's no way to do it from your blood, because that blood is your own genome. And as you mentioned, part of making sure someone doesn't have immune rejection is doing a biopsy of the new heart, which happens routinely. And you'd already been all over this ahead of the time and requested an extra sample. So we had an extra sample ready to go, and we decided to sequence the entire genome because we just didn't know what we were dealing with. Whereas before, when we were diagnosing hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we had a label. So we said, let's look at these 10 genes first. And we found the answer in those 10 genes. Here, we didn't know what we were looking for, so we sequenced the whole thing, which is something that we can do now. And that's a lot of the stories of the arc of the book over the 10 years are how we went from that being incredibly, multi-billion-dollar, multi-country thing to something we really can do sort of on request. And so, yeah, so we sequenced it. And then the first thing we saw was your original variants. And we were like, this is impossible. How could you have got a heart with the same variant? That just seemed impossible. And then we realized that, of course, what we'd done was not just sequence your new heart, but we'd sequenced the piece of tissue that we were given that included your heart, plus the new heart with the new genome and the blood cells that were yours, that were traversing through it at the moment that piece of heart was taken out. So we actually had two genomes. And so that wasn't an easy one either. We had to develop tools essentially to subtract your genome. So we had to go sequence your own genome that you were born with from the genome in your heart. And then we sequenced the tissue that contained both genomes and subtracted your own one. And then in doing that, we found something that was just short of definitive, but in reality, a very suspicious variant that looked like it could most likely explain this presentation with your heart. And I think that was a remarkable thing that you pushed us to do. But I was just as amazed, I think, by your reaction. I mentioned this, and I don't know if you knew I was going to write that in the book, but I was sort of surprised by your reaction. Maybe tell us about that when you heard that.
Colleen Kalashu was my genetic counselor at the time, and she's fantastic. She had pinged me and said, hey, we got the results back. Maybe you can come in and we can have coffee and go for a walk and talk about it. And so I'm thinking, okay, nothing showed up. That sounds like a very casual clinic appointment. And then I get to the hospital, and she goes, actually, we're going to go to Euan's office. And I went, oh, it's like, that means they found something. And so she's talking about something else. And the whole time I'm going, ba-bump, ba-bump, ba-bump. And, sitting down and hearing that you had found a variant that wasn't necessarily the full culprit. I think there was some analogy to bank robbers and possible suspects. Obviously it had consequences down the line, and it was certainly not a fun thing to find out. But like I said, I'd been doubting that something was wrong since, maybe day 4 of transplant. And so it was quite validating to be correct.
Yeah, and I think at some level, I think I wasn't sure which way this meeting would go. Would it be very upsetting for you, which I thought was probably more likely. But actually, the first thing you did was smile. I think it was kind of a smile of I knew it, kind of, it's sort of some validation, I think, was my impression of what you were feeling. But I mean, again, to your resilience in the face of the life that you have described, to be in the situation where you have this new heart that has been otherwise working well, but has these conduction blips where it hadn't been working, and that you now had a pacemaker again, to be unlucky enough to have that happen, and yet be here and smiling. And tell us about your life now. I mean, I gave a little hint in some of your bio, but you're just one of the most remarkable people I know. I mean, given everything that we've learned tonight about what you've been through, tell us about what you're doing now.
Well, I have to give big credit to my therapist, because she's the one that's heard all of the less happy moments. But I nowadays it definitely pushed me into learning more about organ transplant, about the process, about chronic illness. It really kind of opened up this world to me that I hadn't been that tapped into pre-transplant, because again, like I said, it was Leilani's quirky thing. It wasn't, Leilani with a defining disability. And so I really wasn't connected to the community beforehand. And, I gave a talk at Stanford Medicine X about my story, and that kind of took off. And I started doing events outside of Google, found that I was spending more time doing those events than at Google. And so ended up working at a startup for a while in patient advocacy, and have kind of branched out from there into, learning more about medical education and policy and insurance. Anyway, it's really opened my eyes to how many things came together to make my story the way it was, and how many were maybe changeable.
Yeah, and I think that the inspiration that you give, and we've been at I think various meetings where you've talked or I've talked, or but I remember a number of occasions where you've told your story, and I could look around the room, given that I know the story, but I just see people hearing it for the first time, just aghast at like what it is that you've been through it. But they're also in celebration of the fact that you are there. You are talking about how you've lived through this, your resilience in the face of it, and you're an inspiration to these people. And I know that you have a close knit community within the transplant group, but just how important community and individual patient support is phenomenal, and could not be understated. But equally, there are leaders in that area who will step out of just the one-to-one or the small group sessions and really be on the national stage. Even I know you've done work with the American Heart Association in patient advocacy, and I think just really applaud you for doing that. And I think this is so much value for other patients. We hear that so often.
Well, thank you. I will say it's interesting, that juxtaposition. In your introduction, they mentioned the award you had won from AHA in I think 2017. That was the first and only AHA meeting I'd been to. And I'm sitting in the audience. I had no idea you were getting this award. And they go, Euan Ashley. And I go, of course.
Of course, that guy. That guy.
And then for you to be in the audience when I was speaking at AHA about my experience, it was just kind of wow, I've really dove into this world. But it's been really rewarding. Yeah.
No, it's been incredible. And I see we just have a few minutes left. There's a few questions popping up, and some of them are. One of them we just answered actually, which is how you're doing now, and what sort of things that you can do. And so we'd certainly be happy to hear more about that. But maybe let me answer one of the other ones first, which is what sort of genetic testing should someone do if they have heart disease in their family? Well, it's a very topical question, and it because of something I'll just mention in a moment. We've been talking here about rare genetic disease. It's not actually that rare. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is about 1 in 500, 1 in 400 in the population. So for a rare disease, it's actually relatively common. But that category of diseases is the ones for which we've been doing genetic testing for many years. And it's been pretty focused. In general, we've done 10, 20 genes. The genome has allowed us to be able to look much further beyond that. But actually for general heart disease, like heart attacks and high blood pressure, and that sort of we call those common or complex cardiovascular diseases, to contrast them with these single gene disorders where just one letter is changed in the family. And actually genetics has had a lot of promise for those conditions, but it hasn't yet been fulfilled. And I say yet, actually the timing is great, because this year, in fact, just in a few months at Stanford, we'll be among the first healthcare systems to launch a new version of the genome where we just cover it at a very low level. So to diagnose Leilani's heart, for example, we covered every spot in the genome 40 times to get the depth we needed to really be confident about what we were saying. But if we cover it just 1 or 2 times, we can actually put together risk scores that help us understand someone's chance of getting cardiovascular diseases like heart attack and high blood pressure and others. And those are sometimes called polygenic risk scores because they include maybe even millions of variants across the genome that are all very, very small effect by themselves, but then add up because there's millions of them. And so those are going to be available actually at Stanford starting in the fall, and both in the cardiology clinic, but also in primary care. So right now, if you go to your doctor and say, I'm worried about my risk for heart attack, they'll ask you about smoking and diabetes and cholesterol. But they actually don't ask you much about family history, and it's not included in the formal predictor. But from this fall, we actually have developed and will launch a brand new nature and nurture version of that, where we actually will do we call it low pass, because we cover your genome once or twice. And that's enough for us to include the nature part and actually give you a much more precise estimate of your risk for heart attack. And so when it comes to, should you take a cholesterol medicine, for example, that'll be a much better guide. So that's that one. So maybe back to you. Tell us some more about what you're doing. We've done some events where you have sung, because we haven't talked much about that, but you have a beautiful singing voice. And now maybe you aren't singing as much, but performing in other ways. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm not singing as much, which is unfortunate. Yeah, I think our last event was quite a few years ago. But still singing for fun, and have kind of channeled that energy more into speaking and writing. So, during the pandemic, it's been a lot of writing, attempting to create my own book at some point, but mostly think pieces. And it's been fascinating to me how this whole last year has been this, wide open and into health op-eds and problems. And it's like, wait a second, now everybody's writing this stuff.
Yes, right.
The competition has gone way up.
Right.
Yeah. And
but not.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, not everyone has your story, is what I was going to say. So
that's true.
And maybe before we don't let Nora back in to close us out, I did mention at the beginning you were award winning. Tell us about the writing that has won this recent award.
Oh, thanks. So this has been, this is a piece that actually combines, talks about, intimacy, like nerve feelings, and then also flashes back to moments in the OR when I coded. So it's kind of a lot of that amalgamation of how I think about the world now, which is that, unfortunately trauma informs a lot of it, but the positive side being it is nice to express creatively, and it informs how I want to live my life. So there's actually, if I can plug myself, there's
please
a reading on May 6th of all the award winners, and it will be through the Stuck at Home concert series. So
yeah, a great series if you get a chance to go and join in for that. Well, Leilani, thank you so much for joining me tonight and for sharing your story in the book so generously, and also live here tonight. I am constantly amazed and just in awe of you and everything you've been through and what you're doing, building on that for other people, and just your optimism in the face of everything you've been through. It's just jaw-dropping to me. So thank you.
Well, thank you for taking such good care of my story in your book, and really, giving me a chance to read through it and make sure that the story was right. So appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, Nora, I think you're back on.
I think I am back on, and I'm happy I am able to tell you both thank you for a really, truly wonderful and inspiring discussion. Leilani, thank you for your generosity in sharing your story. And Euan, thank you for sharing your science and your humanity and all the other things that you've managed to bring together as both a physician and a researcher, and then as an obviously wonderful doctor and friend. So this has been a terrific evening, and I think the audience has probably enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you very much, and we wish you all the best. Good night, everyone.
Night, thanks.